time for this debate has expired. I call on Members' Order of the Day number 1.
Sale and supply of alcohol, extended licensing hours during Rugby World Cup Bill, second reading.
David Seymour.
Mr Speaker, I move that the sale and supply of alcohol, extended licensing hours during Rugby World Cup Bill be now read a second time. Mr Speaker, this is a bill that will allow communities to use some of the most prized facilities, including the many great pubs, bars and clubs and other licensed venues during what is the largest festival on the 4-yearly New Zealand calendar, the Rugby World Cup. I look back with fond memories to the Rugby World Cup being hosted in New Zealand, and particularly in my city, Auckland, only 4 years ago, and I believe that we are in for a fantastic festival made better by the enablement given by this bill. It's a victory for the presumption, Mr Speaker, that New Zealanders are free to do as they please unless they are harming others, and given good reason for restraint on that freedom. And I raise that point, which should be redundant, because too many in this debate have come from the opposite presumption, that we should be constrained unless we are able to justify ourselves acting freely. I'd like to thank the committee, the Justice and Electoral Select Committee, for the excellent work that they have done on improving this bill. Ironically enough, having to meet at some non-standard hours to carry out that work. I'd like to thank Labour's Jacinda Ardern, who did some pretty good work on the bill, and also Pene Henare. I'd like to thank Clayton Mitchell from New Zealand First, who, as a bar owner of something like 25 years' experience, proved invaluable in giving advice on the technicalities of the bill. And I'd like to thank my colleagues from the National Party, particularly Jackie Dean. I would like to thank the Green member Kevin Haig, but I have to say he has made that more difficult than it needed to be. And I want to take some time to visit some of the litigations, I guess, that occurred in the Select Committee and why I believe the Select Committee arrived in the right place. It is true that when this bill was introduced, I was committed to doing everything possible to looking into several conditions that the Greens believe should be added to the bill before it passed. One of those was that facilities in proximity to schools should be excluded. We looked into that. One was that operators who have recently been penalised in their licensing should be excluded, and we'll discuss that. Another was that the number of games should be restricted, and we'll discuss that. Well, what happened, Mr Speaker, is that we sincerely looked into the matter of proximity to schools, and as you should when you do good regulation, we thought about this in terms of cost-benefit analysis. How much harm could be reduced by placing this restraint into this law? And what we discovered, as it happens, is that most of the games fall on the weekend, and a third of the tournament takes place during a 2-week school holiday. By and large, children do not go to school during the holidays and on the weekend, and it transpired that only 3 games take place on what you might call a school morning, where the spectre of kids going to school with people pouring out of pubs was an actual possibility. That's 3 out of 48 games. Mr Mallard at the back can tell us what 3 divided by 48 is. It's a very small percentage, something... I'm waiting. You there yet? To think he used to be a teacher, 0.125. In any case, Mr Speaker, the fact of the matter is that it was a very small portion of the possible games. And so we decided, especially in light of the fact that those games were the USA versus Japan, for one, New Zealand versus Namibia for another, that the benefit of that restraint would be minimal, but we also took advice that the number of schools that are in any proximity to pubs and clubs is actually surprisingly large once you do the modelling, as was done back in 2012 for the Primary Act. So we decided, having given, I think, fairly sincere and just consideration, not to take that step. The question of people who have previously been penalised as operators not having the bill apply to them has been read into the legislation, or put into the legislation, by the committee. If you have had your hours varied under Section 280 in the previous 12 months, this Act will not, or this bill, this Act will not apply to your operation. Interestingly enough, when we put that particular part up for the vote in committee, the Green Party opposed it. There's just no pleasing some people, Mr. Speaker. Nonetheless, that is now in the bill. Finally, we come to the number of the games. The committee had a very constructive discussion around limiting the number of games to perhaps only 16, which I think is a third of 48. Games, and what happens there is that we actually did not have the numbers on the committee to make that limit. And politics, among any other things, Mr. Speaker, is fundamentally the ability to count. However, what I would say is that I'm actually proud that we will not have, as some proposed, a limit on the number of games and a limit to All Black games only, because what this means is it will be a decision for consumers and a decision for operators of what is a game of interest to New Zealanders, not a decision for politicians. And I'm proud of our multicultural heritage and the fact that there are so many different creeds, classes and races of people who want to make their own choices about entertainment, and that is where we've landed. There was a number of other substantial changes, but before I move to those, I would say that the trust that members have been prepared to put into New Zealanders is a pretty direct measure of how in touch they are with the true nature of New Zealanders, the overwhelming majority of whom are law-abiding, responsible and safe people when they go out to enjoy a community event like this. There is now probably the most substantial change to the bill as introduced is that it will be an amendment to the Principal Act, the Sale and Supply of Liquor Act, rather than a standalone bill. And this is a technicality for drafting purposes and efficiency. However, it does make the bill look dramatically different from the way that it first appeared. The committee also acknowledges in its introductory note that where there is a question of whether RMA-type restrictions on opening hours might constrain the opening of a venue, this Act prevails and the opening hours are extended in spite of any such provisions by local councils under the Resource Management Act, for example. There will be a bright line test. As an electorate MP, Mr. Speaker, I'm very mindful of how people get on with their neighbours, and I happen to live in the most densely populated electorate and represent the most densely populated electorate in the country. And so there's a bright line test for the amount of noise that can be made. The use of amplified music outside, the use of outdoor spaces will not be permitted. The emptying of bottles, which is a real bugbear for people that live near licensed facilities, will not be allowed under the hours mentioned in this bill. But more importantly, there is a penalty that you will lose the right for this bill to apply to you if you, Mr. Speaker, happen to be operating a licensed venue, if a complaint is made to a district licensing committee by the police. It has to be a substantial complaint, but the licensee will actually lose their right to operate under this bill. And that is a very strict sanction against abuse and misuse of this Act. Other than that, the bill has come back largely as it was first introduced to this House. I'd like to thank again the committee who have worked very hard, very rapidly and often at unusual hours to get the bill into its present state. And I'd like to finally just re-emphasise that this is a victory for the presumption that New Zealanders are free to do as they please unless they are given justifications for their freedoms being restricted. This is not supposed to be a country where you are presumed unfree unless you can justify yourself to the busybodies. And with that in mind, I commend this bill to the House. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to.